change the topic. The topic is using survey data to study gender, gender and electoral choice in the United States. And without further ado, allow me to introduce Professor Harold Clarke.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Peter. I greatly appreciate your invitation to participate in this colloquium. It's a very interesting venture, and I look forward to future meetings as well. And thank you to everyone else who is here, to Stan, of course, and to other people. This is, of course, an unusual venue for us. Many of us now, though, have been teaching using programs like Microsoft Teams or Zoom, which I use to teach my time series analysis class at the University of Essex this summer. And so I'm starting to learn about these programs, although I will be the first to admit that I have a lot more to learn. So this evening, I'm going to ask Carl to actually help me by moving through the different slides that I have for my presentation, and I'll be happy, of course, to take questions. I understand from the program that we will have a question session at the end, and so that will be very nice. But what I want to do tonight in terms of the presentation is to sort of bring together both substance and methodology, focusing on a topic which I think is very important for what's likely to happen in a few weeks here in the November 3rd presidential election, and that is the topic of how gender may affect electoral choice in the United States, and not just gender per se, but rather gender-related attitudes as well. And as we move through the presentation, I want to also talk about some methodological issues, particularly those related to the use of survey data. And of course, as many will know, the use of national survey data to study voting behavior in major elections, presidential elections, and in the United States midterm congressional elections is something that has been going on now really since the 1950s, and in fact, the very first American National Election Study was even earlier than that, was in 1948, the election that pitted the Democrat, Harry Truman against the Republican Thomas Dewey, and ever since then we have had major election studies in every national election. Of course, many other countries around the world have copied the idea of doing national election studies. I've been fortunate to be able to do, actually starting out when I was still, I think I was 26 years old, started to do the Canadian National Election Study when I was back at the University of Windsor back in the 1970s, and then later did the British election study on several different occasions earlier in the 21st century. And so I've been doing these things for a long time. But the point is, they're not just particular to the United States, but of course, many other countries now, and including very interesting studies, of course, in Taiwan. And as Carl mentioned, over the past decade, I've been privileged to go to Taiwan on several occasions, talking at TDS events and other kinds of in other venues that focused on voting behavior and citizen engagement in the electoral process. And so these studies have been going on for a long time, and for many years, the model was one where you would interview a national probability sample of the electorate, with somewhere around 2 to 3,000 respondents. And that model was one that was used for a long time, continues to be used in a number of studies in the United States and Great Britain, and it is really basically the kind of study that's done with the TDS project in Taiwan as well. And in a number of these cases, the studies will have both pre and post-election components, with there being, an individual level panel where you might interview 2,000 people before the election, and then immediately afterwards try to recapture as many of those people as possible for a post-election wave. Sometimes that kind of model has actually not been able to be carried out for financial reasons. For example, in Great Britain now, we rely very heavily on doing national internet surveys, but still retain a national post-election face-to-face mode survey to maintain a long-running time series. In the British case, going all the way back, actually, to 1963, the year before they started a year before the 1964 British election. In the United States, so they continue to do the pre and post-election ANES model, although they are now, like many other countries, supplementing that with a very large internet component. One of the things to note right at the beginning, as we talk about the methodology of doing election studies, is of course the expense of doing in-person surveys. Certainly in Western countries like Canada and the United States, Great Britain, and so forth, these surveys are enormously expensive. Carl mentioned that I have had involvement with the National Science Foundation, and approximately 25% of our budget, every election or budgetary cycle, would go for a major survey projects like the ANES. And indeed, when I was on the committee last year, or 2 years ago now, excuse me, setting up funding for the 2020 ANES, I believe the cost was close to $12 million, and the vast majority of that, 80% or more, was being devoted to the face-to-face component. So this is a very, very, expensive enterprise, and it's one that, as we'll discuss, has some methodological advantages, but also some distinct methodological drawbacks. In the Canadian case, it's interesting that the CES, the Canadian Election Study, actually abandoned face-to-face interviewing as early as 1988, and that's a long time ago now. At that point, they didn't. The internet, of course, was not as developed as it is now, but they went to RDD, random digit dialing telephone interviewing, for their surveys, and have continued to do that right up to the present, although now they also, like other countries, have a large internet component as well. So the methodology of these studies is one that has evolved over time, and there are good reasons, practical cost reasons, and methodological reasons, as we'll discuss, why that's so. Tonight I'm going to, sort of in terms of substance, to join with methodology, I'm going to talk about how gender, candidate gender in particular, and gender attitudes towards the role, particularly the role of women in economy and society, influence electoral choice. Then we'll end up at the end talking about dynamic modeling, time series analysis of the approval, presidential approval by men and women, going all the way back using data that, again, are survey data that have been gathered by the Gallup organization and by the Michigan University of Michigan for sentiment surveys. And this will lead us to a little discussion at the end about what's likely to happen here in the November election. So, Carl, could we advance the slide, please?
Surely.
Yeah. Okay, so there will be a familiar, a familiar picture, a familiar figures at least for many of you. There, of course, the woman is Hillary Clinton, who was the Democratic candidate for president in 2016. And there, of course, also everyone will recognize our current president, Donald Trump, who is the Republican candidate and eventually the person who won that election. And so let's move on to the next slide. We're going to talk about voting in that 2016 election, and in particular, from the methodological point of view, we're going to talk about something called the Cooperative Congressional Election Survey, which is a very large national representative pre-post election survey that's done every 2 years, not just in midterm congressional elections, but in presidential election years as well. This is an internet survey that is done by YouGov, which is a very famous international internet survey company. I'm happy to say that I was actually, along with my colleagues on the British Election Study, we were the very first major academic project that YouGov did way back in 2001. So that's a long time ago, but we have worked with a lot of our work we've done with YouGov over the intervening years, interviewing hundreds of thousands of people actually. Anyway, the CCES is done by YouGov USA under the direction of Doug Rivers out at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. The principal investigators for the CCES are two people by the name of Stephen Alonso Behair, who is a political scientist at Harvard, and Brian Schaffner at Tufts. Brian was one of my program directors when I was at the National Science Foundation, and he is now the leading PI with the CCES. The really intriguing thing to me about one of the most intriguing things about the CCES is that its sample size, and instead of having 2,000 or 3,000 people as the ANES has historically, we are up with a pre-election survey of the CCES of about 60,000 people, and then about 50,000 in the post-election survey. And so it's a very large sample size, and that gives us a lot of interesting methodological leverage for addressing some interesting questions such as I'll try to illustrate tonight. And a second thing that's really interesting about the CCES is that it has this core module, which is put together by Alonso Behair and Schaffner, but then teams, up to about 50 different teams, can buy in as partners into the CCES, and you will get a sample of about 1,000 people yourself for specialized questions, plus access to all of the core survey data, all the 60,000, and it costs about $10,000 per module, and that doesn't may seem like a lot, but actually by the standards of survey research, getting 60,000 respondents, a panel survey pre-post, plus your own specialized questions, including experimental questions if you wish, is a genuine bargain. And so we have bought into the CCES on several occasions. One of the things we did in 2016, and indeed we're replicating that this year, is with our UTD module, which we're actually doing in conjunction with colleagues at SMU, Southern Methodist University, that Carl alluded to earlier on, mentioned in passing, is that we have asked a set of questions about women's roles and statuses in economy and society. That's not by far the only thing we asked, but it's one of the things we asked. And when we did this, I thought it would be interesting to see what what the responses were, just as top lines or marginals. But it turns out that these are actually very interesting in terms of theory and substance as well. Carl, can we go to the next slide, please?
Certainly. Sorry.
Okay, there. I won't go through all these in detail, but we asked a battery of 6 agree-disagree items, Likert scale items, about women's roles in economy and society, picking up on all of them designed to pick up on this dimension of people with very traditional ideas about what women, what a woman's place is in economy and society, to more progressive contemporary views of women in economy and society. And you can read the questions there, the statements for the questions, such as there's a lot of equality between men and women in the United States. Women often earn lower salaries than men for doing the same jobs. Most people feel threatened by women who are strong, et cetera, et cetera. And so those are the items that we are going to use to build our scale, our measure of attitudes towards women's roles. And it turns out that this will be a very interesting, at least I think it's a very interesting variable. But first of all, just to see very simply, Carol, if we go to the next slide, if we move on to our next slide, what we've got here is just simply the distribution of voting behavior, that is for Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. And by the way, of course, Clinton was the first woman candidate for a major, a major party in the United States. The United States has never had, unlike many other countries now, the United States has never had a woman president, and Hillary was the very first one. So if we go to figure 1 to the next slide, please, Carl. There we go. Thank you. What you can see is all of those red bars there, which are the red portion of those bars, those 6 bars, indicate the percentage of people who, if they held a traditional view of women's roles, voted for Donald Trump. And you can see that the traditionalists were very, very strongly in favor of now President Trump, and only small minorities actually voted for Hillary Clinton. And of course, if we'd done that the other way, had put the, in terms of those with progressive attitudes, we would have seen exactly the opposite. So as a bivariate, in bivariate analyses, these variables here, based on these statements, have very strong correlations with voting in the 2016 presidential election. And so I said, well, that's quite interesting. But of course, perhaps that is something that is not going to stand up to multivariate modeling when we impose statistical controls in our analysis. There are many other variables, of course, that influence electoral choice, and some of them may be very highly correlated with attitudes towards women's roles, and that's a very plausible hypothesis. So let's move to the next slide, Carl. Thank you. So what we're going to do is to do a multivariate model of the vote. We're going to do a binomial Logit analysis, and in fact, for the dependent variable, we'll be voting for Hillary Clinton versus voting for Donald Trump. With whoops, somebody wants to admit, so we admit them, and so The multivariate Logit model, I believe, as I recall, is scored 1 if you vote to the dependent variable, 1 if you vote for Hillary, and 0 if you vote for Trump. Now, as I said, this is important because attitudes towards same-sex, other things like attitudes towards abortion, same-sex marriage, liberal conservative ideology, party identification, a sense of racial resentment, et cetera, the list goes on, are all things that have fairly sizable bivariate correlations with these attitudes towards the traditional versus progressive attitudes towards the roles of women. And so, it behooves us to take a look at what's going on here. And so we do. And what we find is that the effects of the scale of attitudes towards women are significant and correctly signed in all of our in the basic analysis, and then because we have several different covariates on the right hand side of this model, we go ahead and test the robustness of the effects of our attitudinal, of our women's attitude variable, by running all combinations of regressors. So we conduct 16,384 regression analyses. And so this is very, very easy to do. There's a stata-ado file that does this for you, and that you can download a stata-ado program. But this is something that I would mention from the methodological point of view, is that we practically always, if you send a paper using observational data analyses, multivariate models of voting behavior or whatever you're studying, either ordinary regression analyses or some kind of discrete choice models, your reviewers will say, oh, well, have you tried what happens if you use this variable or take this variable out, or so on. They're always challenging the specification of the model. And so it's nice to do these robustness checks of various kinds. And one of the ones that's most straightforward is to simply test all combinations of regressors. And the stata-ado file that I mentioned gives you a total summary of all the results, graphs the size of the beta coefficients, the regression coefficients, etc. And so I strongly recommend this to people. This is a very straightforward kind of procedure, and so we employed it here. And I've done some larger models where I've actually had up to a million different combinations of regressors. And so this is something that you can do while you're having breakfast or whatever in the morning, or watching TV in the evening. This is a fun thing to do, and you get very nice summary results with this stata-ado file, which was written by a sociologist at Stanford University. His name escapes me right now, but the program is a very nice one. And so let's go to the next slide, if we could, Carl. There's a summary of the basic regression model, and you can see all the different covariates that we have in there, and their direction of their effects, and whether or not they're statistically significant or not. The one I highlight in red is the scale of attitudes towards women's roles and statuses. And as you can see, it has a very healthy t-statistic there of minus 4.14, statistically significant at the O.1 level. But of course, with the large sample size that we have with the CCES, we don't want to get too impressed by simply getting a statistically significant and correctly signed result. After all, this is a very large sample, and so the standard errors then are going to, the central limit theorem is going to kick in for us, and we are going to find that lots of things are statistically significant. What's important to do, however, we can go to the next slide if you would, Carl. I appreciate that. What's interesting and important to do is to actually take a look at the strength of the effect of the covariate of interest or the covariates of interest, if you are, as the case may be, depending on your research project. And so here we are focusing. There's another person who wishes to join. That's good. And so what we do here is to see how the probability of voting for Hillary Clinton changes as people's attitudes towards women's roles move from progressive to traditionalist or vice versa, controlling for the effects of all the other variables. And, since this is a Logit model, you're going to have, a nonlinear specification, of course. We are going to have to choose what those values are going to be for the other variables. And here, I'm just showing you the case where all other variables are set to their mean values. And of course, in general, you could construct all sorts of different interesting scenarios. You could look at the effects amongst, minority men, or you could look at the effects amongst people who are Democratic Party identifiers, or whatever you like. And again, I might just mention as a sort of software footnote, as many of you will know, I'm sure, but I'll mention it anyway, that Stata has a very powerful program called Margins, which you can use to do these kinds of post-regression analyses in order to look at the strength of the effects of various variables of interest, predictors of interest, covariates of interest. And, of course, we strongly recommend this particularly in situations where sample sizes are very large. And so it's not that hard to get a significant effect, but the size of the effect is very important. And as you can see here, amongst people at the progressive end of the continuum, the probability of voting for Clinton is fully 0.83, and that falls all the way down to 0.10 amongst people who have very traditionalist attitudes. And so, the bivariate model then is telling us that in 2016, that attitudes towards women's roles and statuses had a big effect, controlling for everything else, on how people voted, whether they preferred Hillary over Donald Trump or vice versa. Now, this is an interesting finding. We'll go to the next slide if we could, please, Carl. Famously, after the election was over, Hillary Clinton went on a number of talk shows on television, wrote articles, even had a book that she published where she argued that she was defeated. She lost that election. She mentioned several reasons, but one she mentioned again and again was that she lost because a lot of the voters in the United States were misogynists. They didn't like women, and they wouldn't vote for her because she was a woman. And that's a very interesting conjecture. And our results here speak to that point. And clearly, at the individual level, there are large effects of attitudes towards women on how people voted in this election. And the effects, as we have just said, are very robust. We run over 16,000 regressions, and they always turn out basically the same, no matter what combination of predictors you use. Now, we should also note, though, that during the campaign, Hillary Clinton was quite happy to talk about her discussions with Donald Trump, rather, about the role of women and the question of misogyny. And Hillary is quoted as saying, "Mr. Trump accused me of playing the woman card." well, if fighting for women's health care and paid family leave and equal pay is playing the women card, then deal me in. She actually emphasized this issue. She didn't back away from it out of fear that people would vote against her. Rather, she emphasized it. And he said, well, gee, that's really inconsistent with the way she talked about this after the election. And actually, that's true. And so we can ask the question, did traditionalist attitudes towards women's roles then and statuses cost Hillary the election? And the answer is no. It's very unlikely that that was the case. But because if you look at the distribution of attitudes on those questions about women's roles and statuses, you see that there is a progressive majority, about 60, depending on where you make your, all these kinds of cuts are arbitrary, but reasonably speaking, you'd say between 60 and 70% of the voters had quite progressive attitudes, and so, or really reasonably progressive attitudes. And so, any time that you can, say to a candidate, hey, if you prime this issue, if you emphasize this issue, you're going to have 70% of the people on your side. That's something that a candidate will listen to. So at the aggregate level, Hillary was actually, by making this issue salient, she gained more voters. I'm virtually certain than she would lose. And it is not the case either that people in battleground states such as Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio or Pennsylvania were particularly misogynist and holding traditional attitudes. We have enough cases in the CCES study to look at those, voters in those states as a group at least, and we see exactly the same kinds of results. So on the substance then, Hillary is right at the individual level, she's wrong at the aggregate level, and the CCES is a really interesting project because it allows us to investigate this issue in a way that even with 2,000 people in the ANES would be difficult to do. And so these large survey, sample sizes, large samples are really, really useful to us for turning individual voting studies into studies that can actually talk about election outcomes. And that's one of the really important things that is possible for us now in the 21st century, when this really wasn't on the horizon for us earlier on, and still isn't on the horizon for us if we insist on doing in-person surveys. Practically speaking, at least in the United States and countries I know, you'll never get that kind of money. So, and by the way, just to conclude this, if you look at those 6 questions, none of them have anything to do with politics, which is really interesting. There's no reference to Hillary or Donald, no reference to Republicans or Democrats, no references to liberals or conservatives. So I think this is a very interesting finding, and it's made possible by yeah. So Carl, shall we move on to the next one?
Certainly. Yeah.
Okay. The second one I'm going to talk about is one that goes after the supply side of elections, and the influence of that is the nature of the candidates. The nature of the candidates, and this is a topic that has been of interest to at least to American political scientists all the way back into the 1960s, when people like the late Warren Miller and Don Stokes, the late Don Stokes, tried to study relationships between what was going on in particular congressional districts and in terms of representation in their famous article, Constituency Influence in Congress, and the attitudes and behavior of individual voters. Well, in the area of And that study, by the way, and those studies were rightly criticized early on for, although they were interesting, again, the sample sizes when you went to the congressional district level, I think they had an average of about 20 respondents per congressional district, and so their ability to really do any analyses were quite limited. They were also limited by not just by data, but by the absence of statistical procedures, particularly multi-level or hierarchical linear models that we now have available to us. In the world of women in politics, there's a great amount of literature, lots of literature now, lots of discussion about the recruitment of women candidates and the difficulties, in recruiting women have of getting themselves recruited for public office, candidacy, and changes in that over time. However, there were remarkably few and systematic statistical analyses of the effects of candidate gender on electoral choice. And I was really sort of surprised by this. What difference does the supply side make? What if you have a woman candidate? What difference, other things being equal, does this make? And so that's what this particular analysis addresses. And again, the ANES surveys, the ends are much too, traditional surveys at least, although they're starting, as I say, to change now with new internet surveys. The ANES surveys are much too small to study congressional district effects. And so, in fact, recognizing this, following up on a point I made a moment or so ago, the National Science Foundation actually dropped the midterm congressional component of the American National Election Study and did that. I think the last midterm ANES study was back about 2000 or 2002. I was actually on the committee when we made the decision to drop the midterm ANES. We didn't really know what the alternative would be, but fortunately Alonso Beher and Schaffner came along fairly quickly, within 5 or 6 years, and started to develop the CCES surveys, which we've talked about earlier this evening. And the CCES surveys, of course, are characterized by these very large ends, and that makes them well suited to study district-level effects of various kinds, not just the effects of having different combinations of men and women candidates, but all sorts of other kinds of things that congressional election scholars have talked about over the years in terms of the composition of electoral districts and what those kinds of effects might be in terms of different kinds of contextual effects regarding economic effects, different kinds of combinations of ethnicity and race, and so on and so forth, regional political cultures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what we do here is to use the 2018 CCES midterm congressional election study to study the impact of candidate gender effects with a multi-level model. And I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with multi-level models, but they're very, very interesting techniques. And again, for people who study political and particularly election-related phenomena, they're very important because they really do allow us again to study the context in a way that district context in a way that we could not do. Of course, in general, you could use them to study differing temporal contexts as well, and that's an interesting topic. Carl and I have pursued this, doing something called HAPC modeling with the TDES data to look at generational effects, period effects, and life cycle effects with the development of democracy in Taiwan. And so that's another application of this type of modeling procedure. Right, Carl?
Yes, and we got an article in the electoral studies too. Yeah,
that's right, we do. And so anyway, so what we're going to do here, could you move to the next screen, Carl?
certainly. Yeah.
what we're going to do here is a multi-level modeling exercise with the 2018 CCES. Again, my colleagues and I at UNT or at UTD and SMU have bought into the study, and so we have all the data, the general core data from the 2018 CCES, plus we have our own module as well. But here we're going to rely on the core data because the core data, of course, has this huge sample size. Now, just before we get to that, however, I wanted to just show you a couple of simple graphs here that show you the dynamics of the of women's candidacy for the House of Representatives from about 1970 all the way up to 2018. And you can see three lines there, one for Democrats in blue, one for Republicans in red, and then one for the total of Democrats and Republicans. And those are the number of women candidates for the House of Representatives in each successive election every 2 years since 1970. And of course, it's very obvious that there's an upward trend in those numbers, particularly for the Democrats, and that you can see that there's actually quite an acceleration here as we move from 2016 to 2018. We had the largest number of candidates, women candidates ever for the House of Representatives, 240 running for office across the country. Most of those, a large majority, were Democrats, but we also had 52 Republicans as well, going along with 188 Democrats. Then Carl has gone now to the next slide, and the next slide actually shows us the number of women who were elected to the House of Representatives. And again, for the total number, of course, is going up. Again, a very sharp and distinct upward trend. And most of this, as we can see, that trend is being driven by the success of Democratic women running for the House over this time period. And again, you can see as we move from 2016 to 2018 that there is a sharp, sharp increase. And so we have the largest number of women now in the House of Representatives that we've ever had. And most of those women, of course, are Democrats. And so, what we're going to do with this analysis is we're going to study the supply side. Does it make a difference controlling for everything else in a standard congressional election vote model that the candidate is a man or a woman? And of course, it's not just, we don't just have one man or woman. We have to look at the combinations. What happens if you have a Democratic man, a Democratic and a Republican man? All the four combinations of gender for Democrats and Republicans are going to be the contextual level variable that we're going to focus on, and we're going to do this with a multivariate, with a multi-level, multivariate model, which we will talk about in just a moment. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, Carl. Thank you. The next slide just shows you the levels of success for these four different combinations of gender and party. And as you can see in these simple bivariate, tabulations here, there really isn't much, there aren't large differences. For example, if you have two, the classic case of two men running, a Democratic man and a Republican man, sort of the very traditional sort of view of American, electoral politics. The Democrats had a very good year in 2018, and you've got 54% of the Democrats and for a Democratic vote, 43% for Republicans. If you have a Democratic man and a Republican woman, that goes to 58 and 39. That's sort of the biggest departure, if you will, from the classic position. But generally speaking, if you look at those bar graphs, you would say, gee, the effects, if there are effects on the supply side, gender supply side effects, they're not terribly large. And it turns out that that's actually what we will find as we move ahead. But more on that in just a moment. Let's go to the next slide, if we could, please, Carl. To the next slide. Okay, here is a summary of our multi-level model of candidate gender effects. And whoops, no, go back, Carl, if you could go back, please. There we go. And it's just that I want to talk about that, if I could, for just a moment. Some of you in the audience may be familiar, maybe a lot of you, I'm not sure, with multi-level models. The neat idea of a multi-level model, multi-level models, by the way, were pioneered in terms of applied research in educational psychology, where people were studying student achievement, and they were trying to do this with a combination of factors particular to the individual level factors, but also, what difference did it make what class you were in? What your teacher, are there teacher effects? Are there effects of the kinds of resources available to students in the class? Are there effects of being in different, having different classmates? So-called frog pond effects, where they find that, for example, women students tend to do better in classes, other things being equal, where they have a large number of women in the class, or minorities doing better when there are more minorities, and things like this, and so forth. And then, of course, you could nest the classes within schools, and so on and so forth, to have a hierarchy of more than 2 levels. These are the multi-level models, which now have been applied widely for a variety of applications, including what we have here today. The basic equation there is right at the very first line there, and the key coefficients there, of course, are the intercept, the B0J, and what I call the BMJ. Well, that BOJ, we will, in this modeling context, we're going to turn that into a not just a constant, quite the opposite. It's going to be a random intercept with a particular distribution, in this case a normal distribution, and we're going to be able to actually parameterize that distribution in terms of a variety. In our case, the variation will be over these 400 and some odd congressional districts, and we'll be able to parameterize it in terms of the gender of the Republican and Democratic candidates, plus a number of other factors such as incumbency, the socioeconomic composition of the district, its racial and ethnic makeup, and so on. That's a basic multi-level model. But then interesting also here in our context is allowing some of the BMJs to be random variables, the regression coefficients to be random as well. And in particular, the one that we're going to focus on here is that one that focuses on attitudes towards women's roles, again, similar to what we did with the earlier analyses that I talked about earlier this evening. And when we allow those one or more of those regression coefficients to be random variables, we can then do what we call, we can study what are called cross-level interactions. So in this case, we're going to be focusing in particular on the interaction between candidate gender and attitude, and people's, the individual voters' attitude towards women's role in economy and society. And so that's our general setup for the multi-level model. In terms of actually, operationalizing these models with statistical software, Stata does this quite easily and quite well. But also in terms of learning about these models, and or teaching them in class, I find that the program HLM, Hierarchical Linear Model Program, developed by two scholars at the University of Chicago, Burke and Rodenbush, rather. One of them is a statistician, one's an educational psychologist, is a very good software for teaching yourself how to work with these models. Of course, you can operationalize them in other software as well. R, for example, has modules that do this, and so forth. But these things, you don't have to write any of your own code or anything like that. They're pretty standard these days, and so they're quite easy to do. Let's move to the next slide, if we could, please, Carl. So what are the results of our analyses? Well, I'm just summarizing. I haven't got all of the output. It's too big to put on one screen here. But what I'm summarizing here are the effects of having what difference does a candidate gender make, and then what difference do we get in terms of the size of the regression coefficient for the women's roles variable, depending upon candidate gender. That cross-level interaction effect that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Well, if you look towards the top, if you look towards the top part of this output, you'll see that in both cases, and here we've got 3 dummy variables for our parameterizing the random intercept, and our reference category is that classic situation where both the Democratic and Republican candidates are men, and then we've got 3 dummy variables for the other combinations. And it turns out that in both cases where we have a Democratic woman either running against a Republican man or a Republican woman, the effect is significant and negative. Significant and negative. And so you might say, well, other things being equal, basically, then there's still some kind of penalty. If you're for a local party, if you run a woman, if you're a local Democratic Party and you run a woman rather than a man, you're going to suffer some, other things being equal, you will suffer some penalty, some electoral penalty. However, further down towards the bottom of the screen, you can see the cross-level interaction and between attitudes towards women's roles and candidate gender. And in that situation where you have a Democratic woman and a Republican man running, then you will see a positive cross-level interaction. Progressive voters equals progressive attitudes towards women's roles, are enthusiastic. Other things being equal, they're more enthusiastic about a woman candidate. And so none of those things do not surprise, but again, we've got this huge CCES sample, so it behooves us to take a look at the size of the effect. So Carl, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So here we're again doing our margins analysis here of this, and we're focusing in this case on the cross-level interaction, and we can see that in fact the effect, although it's statistically significant, of this cross-level interaction between women's roles and running a Democrat, like the Democrats running a woman candidate, is significant and positive, just like the sign, the sign on the coefficient implies in the previous slide. But you can see that the effect is not that great. It goes from about 0.55 up to about 0.59. Now, granted, I make a lot of money if I convince candidates that I can get them increase the probability of people voting for them by 5 points. That there's no question about that. But this is clearly not a huge effect, and we can therefore conclude that in terms the supply side, that it still does make some difference if the gender of the candidate makes some difference in the most recent national American elections, congressional elections. But the effects are not huge, and to some extent they're offsetting, as we have seen. Now, before leaving this, however, I want to, we'll go to the next slide, please, Carl. Want to point out one other thing, and this brings us to things that I think are of interest to us right now, is that one of our predictor variables in the model that I just showed you, of course, was attitudes towards Donald Trump's job approval ratings. We're on the right-hand side of that model. And you might say, well, based on your earlier analyses tonight, Professor Clarke, you'd think there'd be a strong, perhaps a strong effect of attitudes towards women roll on to Trump approval, and then that would have an indirect effect onto congressional voting in 2018. And indeed, that's exactly true. Trump's job approval has a huge effect on the likelihood of voting Democrat or Republican for Congress in 2018. And attitudes towards women's roles, as you can see by this graph, have a very large effect as well. And so the probability of approving Trump's job approval ratings drop precipitously as people move from having traditional to having progressive attitudes towards women's roles. And again, that comes from a multivariate analysis with many control variables, such as we talked about earlier this evening. So women's roles, attitudes towards women's roles, and had a big effect in 2016 presidential election, had a big effect, although mainly indirect, in 2018. And of course, I will say, to look ahead, we can expect them to have a sizable effect in this forthcoming election. And in fact, they may be the principal reason that Donald Trump will be defeated. And so we'll see a little bit more about that as we move to our third presentation, or third part of this presentation. And so that slide there just summarizes what I said a moment ago. And so now let's move towards studying gender attitudes and voting in 2020 to conclude the presentation this evening. And let's move ahead to that. And of course, we don't have our survey. Carl and I are working on national election survey right now. We have a survey which is in the field right now. We've got over 1,900 respondents in the pre-election way, but we don't have anything to say about that yet. That just went into the field yesterday. But let's try to get some leverage then on the dynamics of presidential approval and gender by looking at some aggregate time series modeling and to use those data to see what may be going on in a few weeks. Now, of course, studies of presidential approval and economic conditions go all the way back to the early 1970s. As some of you may know, studies very early on were done in Great Britain and in the United States. And there's been a thriving, literature on the political economy of presidential approval since then. And there are literally hundreds of papers have been written, and many have been published. A number of well-known books by people like Mike Lewis Beck and Helmut Norpoth and others as well. However, that said, there are surprisingly few subgroup analyses. Time series analyses of presidential approval, and in particular, very few analyses. I offered on the British Journal of Science, colleagues several years ago now, but very, very few focusing on gender differences in the political economy of presidential approval. Well, here we're going to use monthly Gallup poll data measuring presidential approval, going all the way from January of 78 all the way through to April of 2020, and we hope to update these a little bit with the last few months. But the story is going to be pretty clear here, as you'll see. So we have Gallup poll measures of presidential approval, standard Gallup measures. We have the Michigan surveys of consumers data, which is a great data set, by the way, for those of you who are political economists. And they provide monthly breakdowns for several variables, including their overall index of consumer confidence. And we can also get other important variables, particularly party identification, on a monthly basis from Gallup all the way back to the 1970s. Well, so we're going to put all of these variables into a model of presidential approval. Also include dummy variables for a number of important events, as well as presidential transitions, from Obama to Trump, for example, or from Clinton to Bush, or what have you. All of the presidential transitions going back to 1980, as a matter of fact, when Reagan defeated Carter. So what do we find with that model? Well, first of all, let me show you a graph here. Can we go to the next one, Carl? This graph, I think, tells a very simple analysis that shows, I think, Donald Trump's one of his key problems as we move through this campaign. The red line there is presidential approval by men. The blue line is presidential approval by women. And we are taking it here from January of 2000 up through April of 2020. And you can see that before the Trump period, starting in January of 2017, the two lines tracked each other very, 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 very closely with the men at larger levels or higher levels of approval in the early period than during the Obama period, women being somewhat more approving of Obama than men. But look what happens as soon as Trump comes into office. Look what happens when Trump comes into office. There is a dramatic fall in presidential approval amongst women. And circa April of this year, the figures were 51% approval amongst men, but fully 10 points lower, only 41% amongst women. And you can see that this has been true for the entire Trump period, and that goes along very well with the kind of narrative that you see in a lot of discussions in the press right now, in the media, about the difficulty Trump is having getting support from women. So that graph, I think, shows a lot and foreshadows what we're going to see in a moment. Can we go to figure 9, please, Carl? Okay, here's figure 9, just to show you what the index of consumer sentiment looks like by gender. The Michigan consumer sentiment data, their index of consumer sentiment. And you can see here that over time, the indices are, for the two gender groups, the index is very, very similar. In fact, the overall correlation is fully plus 0.93. But you can see also that in recent years, and particularly in the Trump era, that consumer sentiment has been substantially larger, stronger for men than for women. And here in April of course, amongst both gender groups, it fell precipitously concomitant with the onset of the COVID pandemic earlier this year. But still, men here are fully 14 points more, higher on the consumer sentiment index, which, by the way, runs from 0 to 200. For those of you who want a little more detail, both groups very pessimistic, but women considerably more so than men. Now, I'm not going to go through. If we can move to the next slide, please, Carol. I'm not going to show you the entire model, but just talk about a couple of the highlights. This is a time series model, political economy model. We're going to do we're going to analyze men and women simultaneously using seemingly unrelated regression analysis techniques. We're going to cover with monthly data the entire period from January of 78 to April of 2020. We're going to use something called an error correction model, which basically is hypothesizing that presidential approval is going to co-integrate. It's going to travel together in dynamic equilibrium with consumer confidence over this entire period. And then we're going to control for a whole bunch of other effects, including party identification, presidential transitions, and a bunch of other events that occurred, like 9/11. You know, big events, transformative events that occurred over this long period. And so, what do we find? Well, control, the big thing for us here tonight, in terms of the substance of this talk, is that this model, this error correction time series model, which is using survey data, both for economic and political, variables, is showing us that net of everything else, the transition from Obama to Trump amongst men was insignificant. Minus 1.6 points is what that dummy variable is. But for women, the effect is huge and statistically significant and negative minus 0.96. Very consistent with the simpler bivariate analysis that I showed you a minute or two ago. And so this again, triangulates on this point that Trump has a big problem with women coming into this presidential election. If he was as popular amongst women as he is amongst men, he would still be in a fight, but would be in a much better position. Final slide, Carl. I promise you, folks.
Yeah.
The final one. Just go back, if you would, please, Carl. One.
Yeah.
There. Okay. Here is Trump approval in 1,253 polls that I took down today from Real Clear Politics, which is one of these big poll aggregators in the United States. And these are 1,253 national polls conducted from January 2017 up through October the 4th of 2020. Okay, and so actually we could go even a little further than that now, but the picture will be basically the same. When Trump started out on trend back in January of 2017, he was at 46%. Where is he today? On trend, 45% in approval. And that's the red line going through that graph, but look at all the variation. All those dots are the 1,253 individual polls, and you can see that they're scattered very widely. But without going into an analysis, which we can do and I intend to do, we'll actually use Bayesian techniques to sort out what are called house and mode effects, the differences of the different polling firms and the different ways of using, like, say, telephones versus internet surveys and so on. You can see that Trump has basically not been able to gain any traction early on. Not just recently, in wake of the COVID pandemic, where you can see the drop there earlier this year. But look back earlier in that graph, earlier in time, he's clearly not getting major traction for the very healthy economy that he wanted to make the cornerstone of his campaign. So even before the pandemic, ruined the American economy, Trump was having trouble getting high approval ratings. And the reason is, I would argue, one of the major reasons is that, quite simply, a lot of women just don't like him. There's nothing he can really do about that. That big intercept effect I showed you a moment ago is again another indicator of this. So finally, let me wrap up. I know I've been going a long time. Let me wrap up. you can see here that in these analyses that attitudes towards women's roles have had large effects on support for or opposition to Trump, controlling other important factors. On the other hand, the gender of candidates still matters, but the effects are quite modest, as we've seen, and to some extent, as I said, offsetting. As we just mentioned, also there's a big Trump intercept effect. Many women just simply don't like it. For better or for worse, he has not been able to get over that hurdle. Methodologically, again, for survey researchers, large, stratified random samples, or quota samples in this case, which surveys like the CCES produce, facilitate multi-level modeling of congressional elections, or for that matter, you could use them for parliamentary elections or any place where you have, a separate electoral district. This is something that researchers have wanted to do for half a century. Now it's quite possible. More generally, in the internet age, surveys are big data opportunities. We typically sort of think of them as having, as I say, quite modest sample sizes. That's no longer the case. And in this regard, we can think of large N's both in space but also in time. What we did in Great Britain was we ran monthly surveys in Great Britain every month from January of 1992 to December of 2015, producing big samples in time as well as in space. Now, of course, the ANES, to give it credit, has continued and now has a big N in time with their so-called time series data set to go all the way back to the 1960s, and you can download those and do various kinds of interesting multi-level modeling. I have one project right now on studying trust in Congress, trust in government. It goes all the way back to 1964, an HAPC model such as Carl and I developed for Taiwan. Finally, 2020 presidential election, as I've emphasized tonight, women's attitudes and attitudes towards women's roles may well determine this election. And right now, it looks like, I looked at Real Clear Politics average, Joe Biden is ahead by about 9 points, and that's a big lead. Whether it will be a race over the next few weeks remains to be seen. There's been something civil unrest this year, and the protests and so on. They're afraid to admit that they are Trump supporters, but it's hard to imagine that that would be enough to wipe out a 10-point lead. The other thing, and the final caveat, of course, is that you don't have to win the popular vote in the United States. You have to win the Electoral College. Trump did that very narrowly by an average of 0.57% in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania last time. That gave him the presidency. Whether he can do that again, that's something that even the best surveys probably won't be able to answer. So at that point, Carl, let me stop and take any questions that people might have. And I appreciate your being with me as an audience tonight, and again, I very much appreciate being invited by Peter and Carl to participate. So, thank you.
Oh, thank you. And all right, I think Peter and I are going to moderate this section, and then we may maybe we can get started with Peter. Would you like to do a dialogue first, or accommodate any questions from the floor, from the audience first? From the audience first, what do you think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So, Carl, do you want to look at the chat box? And probably there are a few questions being raised.
Yes, let me check it out. And I have one question from Elizabeth Stringer. And is there a particular poll you watch most, Dr. Clarke?
I tend to watch my own trend graphs the most. I have every week Furkan, my graduate student Furkan Zangan. I have him download the Real Clear update the Real Clear Politics polls, and so what I like to do most simply is to use what's called the Hodrick-Prescott filter, and to create those trend lines, such as I showed you a moment ago. But historically, people have, of course, relied heavily on the Gallup poll. Gallup poll, we talk about face-to-face probability surveys in, academic surveys being the gold standard. Well, in the world of commercial polls, of course, historically, the Gallup poll has been considered to be somewhat of a gold standard. And our good friend, the late Alan McCutcheon, of course, as you recall, was the Gallup professor at Nebraska, and he used to we used to talk a lot about this topic, and he was a big proponent of Gallup. But I think in general, that has been historic. Gallup now, of course, is not polling. They're not polling, doing presidential election polls very often, if at all, like they have stopped recently. And so there are a whole bunch of other polls out there. One, and if you look at the House effects, if we go ahead and do a Bayesian dynamic factor model looking at House effects, you can see, and you don't even need to do this, you can see clearly some polls like Rasmussen, for example, tend to have very much a Republican, or a Trump bias, if you will. They tend to always score Republicans higher, whereas some other polls, such as polls, conducted by the Washington Post or CNN, tend to have more of a Democratic slant. And so I tend to feel that a quick way, of doing these, of getting a good read, is to do these trend analyses, or more simply, take a look at the averages. Rely upon the averages are I think a good start on this. But I don't have any particular favorite right now. And if you'd asked me this 5 years ago, I would have said Gallup. Of course, YouGov as another one I should mention. YouGov has been very successful with its British polling, and so they are again showing Trump with a sizable deficit right now. So if I had to pick one right now, if I just said to answer the student's question, I'd say if I had to pick one to follow, it would be YouGov. But if I had my druthers, I'd be calculating means and doing House effects and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, and maybe we can take this opportunity, Peter, and maybe we can ask some questions, and because we can take advantage of my position as a host, so that I can ask my own questions, and I'm really interested now. And allow me to take this lead, and other guests, please, if you would like to ask a question, please do so in our conversation box, or you are in the room with Professor Pan, just send him the question or write it down, and either way, we welcome all the questions. Let me get started first. Now, I think that there are some women factor here in this current election. Of course, among the candidates, both are men, and we have a vice presidential candidate, Kamala Harris. And do you think that will bring aboard some women effect to give Joe Biden some advantage? And another women factor I can think of could be just the Supreme Court Justice nominee and ACB, and we should bring some positive impact to Trump campaign. Now the third part is, of course, to rethink about the model about women impact, and will there be more, for example, more man advantage to support Trump to offset the negative sentiments from the women, and particularly, and Trump wants to portray himself like a masculine person. He defeated the COVID-19 in 3 days, and so will there be some will there be some advantage
I
that
want
he
to know
can
how he did it.
offset?
I want to know.
Yeah, but he certainly want to show his man image, and I don't know whether that will offset the women factor in this election. What's your observation?
Well, first of all, I think it's very interesting that we have a Supreme Court nomination process going on right now
Yeah.
with Judge Amy Coney Barrett, being considered for the High Court, and I've watched that quite a bit over the last couple of days, and it's clear that of course, the Democrats are very much opposed to putting what they will see as a very conservative justice, regardless of whether it's a man or a woman, to fill the position vacated by the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it's interesting in this regard that they have heavily emphasized Judge Barrett's attitudes towards abortion. And she is quite a devout Catholic and opposed to abortion, and so they have really emphasized women's right to choose. Well, this will be threatened by putting Judge Barrett on the court, and of course they've also emphasized the issue of health care. And healthcare, our surveys show over the years, is an issue that resonates especially strongly with women, and that everybody likes good healthcare, of course, but it's an issue that has been emphasized typically by women. And of course, the Democrats are accusing Judge Barrett of wanting to do away with Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and implying, of course, that the Republicans would never, if they had they'd just get rid of it. This image of Republicans, the Democrats imply, with health care, that they had this there was a very famous ad in 2012 presidential election where Paul Ryan, who was then running to be vice president with Mitt Romney, was shown with an old lady, his granny, pushing her over the cliff, and this is what the Republicans would do to health care. And so they are very much, pushing this right now. In fact, their whole strategy was to push these two issues in the nationally televised, hearings for Supreme Court. And so we'll see how successful they will be. The other thing you mentioned that I wanted to note, of course, is we now have Kamala Harris, running as the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. Of course, she's not the first woman to run, as a vice presidential candidate. A few years ago, John McCain had Sarah Palin, and so forth as a running mate. So I don't know. Typically, vice presidential candidates don't have much effect. The conventional wisdom is they really, it doesn't really matter who they are or who wins the vice presidential debate. There really isn't much effect, and I suspect that that's probably going to be the case again this time. There really isn't that much media attention paid to Kamala Harris. Some stories, she's the most. The one thing that they are doing on media like Fox is that they argue repeatedly that she's dangerous because she's very left wing. She's a socialist and so forth. But I don't think that will get that much traction. People focus on the president's candidates and don't pay that much attention to the vice presidential candidates. The media may say somewhat more, but the effects just aren't there really.
Okay.
That's been the conventional wisdom. Now maybe we'll all be proved wrong this year, but I don't think so.
Professor Pan.
有没有任何问题 ？Okay, I see there are two more questions from the
audience. Yeah.
Yeah, from the audience. I mean, in the chat box. Maybe Kari can take that. But before you doing that, I'm going to take my advantage of being a co-host and asking my own question of mine. Uh, so whether proactively or reluctantly, Taiwan has been in the midst of the power game between Trump administration and China. So I believe that people around the world, especially people in Taiwan, are highly concerned about who's gonna be the next president of the United States.
Sure.
So following Carl's question and about the gender issue, does gender or gender attitude have an effect on foreign policy debates in this presidential campaign? What do you think about that, Professor Clarke?
Getting a lot of feedback. Ah, there it goes. Okay. No, foreign. It's interesting. In the United States, historically, the argument has been amongst political scientists that foreign policy doesn't matter. Politics stops at the water's edge. Famous analyses like those done by Gabriel Almond, like over half a century ago. The thesis was that the effects were very, very modest, and that particularly people had very scattered, impressions of foreign policy, and it really, no coherent beliefs, as Phil Converse would, famous Michigan political psychologist would say, and so on. In more recent years, some of the work I've done with people like Jason Reifler, who's now in Great Britain, American, but now at Exeter University, and Tom Scotto, my former student Tom Scotto, and so on, suggests that there may be that foreign policy effects may actually be somewhat more, stronger than the early literature would suggest. Trump has tried to argue that he has done, of course, a very good job in terms of eliminating ISIS, killing terrorist leaders, assassinating terrorist leaders, and producing peace. There's no major war going on. Pulling American troops out. That America's involved with pulling American troops back from places like Afghanistan and Iraq, and trying to get them out of Syria and so on. And clearly, before the COVID pandemic hit, he was hoping to run on a traditional peace and prosperity platform. And of course, the first part of that has gone away. And of course, COVID, if you look at public opinion polls, basically crowds out just about everything, including even the economy. Now, he has, as part of his maneuvers, particularly with regard to, well, first the economy and trade, but more recently with finding a scapegoat for COVID. Of course, we all know that he has blamed China. He calls it the China virus. And very early on, back in February, he banned all travel, people coming from China to the United States. And so it's hard to know what all this would produce. I think we would find that things would go on much as they are right now, should Trump win in terms of American-Chinese relations. If he wins a second term, that he would simply continue along the present path. If Biden becomes president, then I think there will be efforts to try to repair relations with China. And of course, the Republicans say that Biden, of course, is being paid off by the Chinese. That you cannot buy Joe Biden, but you can rent him. Or more precisely, you can rent his son Hunter, who then feeds money Biden. Now, it's very interesting. I mean, one of the things, like if I was a Republican, advisor, one of the things I would say in this regard is, hey, Joe, how did you make all that money to buy a DuPont mansion in Delaware? He's never made anything more than the walking around salary of a senator, a couple $100,000 a year at best. You don't buy those kinds of mansions with that kind of money. And of course, right now we know there's a story with with Hunter's presumably his Apple computer being hacked, and or being the drive being accessed and so on. And so they are trying to the Republicans and Trump in particular trying to say that Biden has ulterior motives for a good relationship with China. But who knows how much truth there is in any of this. In this modern era, it's really hard to tell where where the lies end and the truth begins. One of the things I said, I guess it must be about 3 years ago now, Carl. We had a colloquium on Taiwanese politics at UTD, and this was just when Trump was coming into office. And I said one of my big fears was that Taiwan would become a pawn in a power struggle between China and the United States, and that this could be very dangerous. That this was potentially a very dangerous flashpoint. In fact, I went so far to say if there was ever going to be like a third world war, that it might be precisely because of Chinese attempts to really leverage the United States to back off in terms of of the economic sanctions and so forth. And so I still fear for that, and I fear it probably more certainly with Trump as president than with Biden. Whatever Biden's motives are, I think we would see basically a Biden presidency. You would see an attempt to go to the status quo ante, back to the Obama years. You would see an attempt to repair relations with China. You would see the United States rejoin the Paris Accord, and you would see an initiative. You would see initiatives with regard to climate change and so forth. So you would actually, if you want to know what a Biden presidency would look like, I think it would look very much like an Obama presidency, and that's true with regard to foreign policy generally. And I think, insofar as they could, they would try to establish better relations with China. That's just my guess.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right, very detailed. Professor Pan, is it okay to go through some of the questions and remarks from the conversation box?
Yes, please.
Then I'll go back to you and for more questions, maybe from the audience in Taichung. And we have one question from Arman Kafai, and the question reads: just overall, what do you make of the shy Republican theory that some have when discussing polls? For example, people are worried about voicing the support for Trump without being judged. So that's one question. Let me read out another question. Maybe you can answer all together. Maybe answer two questions at a time. And the other question from William Q. Corn. And what do you make of the early vote by mail numbers, according to Target Smart, seeming to contradict the polls, particularly in Michigan and Wisconsin? These are really good questions, Dr. Clarke. There are third questions, and I think I would just let you address these two questions from the audience first, and I'll talk about the third and the fourth.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I think it is likely that there are some shy Trumpsters. I will note that in 2016, there was also discussion about shy Trumpsters. The national level polls actually did quite well in 2016. But of course, they are measuring public opinion nationally, and they are not measuring it at the state level. And of course, the Electoral College was key. The only state of those battleground states where the polls really got it wrong last time in terms of popular vote was Wisconsin. which was the polls in Wisconsin were absolutely off the mark. And I have no idea why. Why Wisconsin? But they were. And, because all the state level polls are more infrequent, they have smaller sample sizes. Sometimes they get companies that are, polling firms, the houses that are not very good, and so on. We can speculate about that. I think this time there will be more shy Trumpsters, but my colleague at SMU, Matthew Wilson, he says 2 to 3%, and I would say 4 to 5% possibly. But again, Biden is looking so far ahead right now that it's hard to think that shy Trumpsters per se would make the difference. Always important, coming to the second question, of course, is turnout. We tend not to talk about that nearly as much, but it's absolutely crucial. It's absolutely crucial. And one of the things, again, methodologically, that all polls get wrong is turnout. Every survey I've ever done, any survey I read in that election study, they always overestimate the vote. Now, telephone surveys tend to be ridiculous. Everybody in telephone surveys say they vote. Internet surveys, not quite as ridiculous, but still not as good. Face-to-face surveys, better yet, but still, on average, over 10% off the mark. So this is, I think, the student or whoever asked that question is really onto something. The turnout is really important. And of course, they're very, very, if you look at Trump's rallies and so on, he clearly has, a very motivated base. And the Democrats have some motivation as well. They had strong motivation here in Texas in 2018 when Beto O'Rourke was running against Ted Cruz. That was clear. But who knows? Who knows? That may even out as well. But the early voting numbers are huge. The early voting numbers are huge. And then finally, I would say indicative of interest in the election is our own survey, our survey that we're running with Qualtrics. We find that we get, I thought we'd have trouble getting 2,000 people in, in 2 weeks. We got almost 2,000 in 1 day, in less than 24 hours. So there's a lot of enthusiasm out there. And what may happen, of course, is it just neutralizes. You've got, there's tremendous polarization and animosity in the American electorate right now, partisan and ideological. And both bases may come out in large numbers. And so it may be largely a standoff in terms of that. But time will tell.
All right. Thank you. We have a third question, and from Kerry Reinhardt. And how do the trends in gender and politics in the United States compare to gender trends in the elections of other countries? Do you have a chance to compare? Maybe look at a British case or a Canadian case or other Asian case.
Yeah, no, the so-called gender gap in the United States is much larger than the other two cases that I'm quite familiar with, which is Great Britain and Canada. In our British surveys, for example, in the 2019 British election survey that you're writing up now for our new book that we're doing on Brexit Britain book. Those questions, we asked those same 6 questions about women's roles and statuses that had such a big effect in the 2016 voting example, my first example tonight. We asked those in Great Britain, and they had very minor effects, very, very minor effects in the British case, and also in both Britain and Canada, just gender, just like looking at, just using a dummy variable for gender in your regression model, have very, very little effects. And in the British case, typically not significant at all.
Well, I want to bring up the Taiwan case. Could be another case for research and further studies. And now Taiwan has a woman president. She could be one of the most.
You can tell me about that one, Carl.
Yes, maybe Professor Pan can talk about it. She could be one of the most popular presidents in the Taiwan history, and I mean since the democratization. Dr. Pan, do you want to chime in on that?
Hey, why don't you go first there, and then I'll follow your. What's your observation?
My observations.
Yeah.
I think it's worth the study. I do not want to conclude because I think if you look at Dr. Clarke's models, and there are more to study, of course, not just from the women voters, but we actually have a lot of women candidates in the
There you go.
legislative elections, and
Yeah.
even in the Congress now, in the women in the legislative yuan in Taiwan, there are more and more women legislators, and actually the mayor, there are more mayors now. One current mayor is also a woman, and entitled. And what I would recommend is any students, any professors could be doing another study using Taiwan data, and
Yeah, no, I
always
think that would be
some
really
research
great,
worth doing.
Carl. That'd be
Yeah,
terrific. If
yeah,
they
good
can get
comparison.
the key to that was getting the big sample size, the CCES, and so
Yeah,
that would be the kind of, if you don't have that, then it's hard to get the aggregate level effects, you know. But
yeah.
that said, no, I think the Taiwanese case would be a great one.
Yeah, we should check if there could be some local level data, or mayoral election level or local election level, then compare to the national data. All right, I think I talked too much. I turn the mic to Dr. Pan. Do you have more questions, additional remarks?
Just additional remarks about the female president right here. I think personally, following the question raised by Carrie, talking
Yeah.
about the comparison, right? The
Yes.
comparing with other countries. I think in Taiwan, in terms of traditional and the progressive, nowadays, my personal observation is people in Taiwan are more progressive oriented.
Mm,
Yeah, so
yeah.
I don't think the traditional attitude would be, it's quite opposite. Quite opposite. No, I take it back.
Hmm.
I think this maybe that's not the issue because as you mentioned that the president, the mayor, and Congress women, a lot of them, right? So I think
Hmm.
Taiwan is moving pretty fast in terms of that gender issue
Mm.
among
Hmm.
other countries. Yeah,
Yeah.
personal
Be
observation.
interesting, you know, be interesting just to ask the question, the kinds of questions on attitudes towards women's roles and statuses. That's a very
Hmm.
interesting attitude, and you can actually then that makes for some very interesting analysis. You don't need as big a sample size for that.
Hmm. Yeah, that could be a good question for next survey. And maybe there may be some surveys there is a general social survey in Taiwan similar to the general social survey in US,
Oh, really?
TDS, and yeah,
Hmm.
definitely there could be some questions related to the women or women
Hmm.
leaders or women voters. And I believe that I still stand by Dr. Pan's original thought that it's more progressive. I
Mm,
think the Taiwan society doesn't mind definitely a women president, a women leader,
mm-hmm.
and encourage
Yeah.
more women to participate in politics. And I think this could be uh, a reflection on the progressive society generally in Taiwan. All right,
Mm.
Dr. Pan, you have more questions, or from your side, do you see more students who would like to raise a question from the floor?
Let me check. Not for now. Mm.
Yep. Okay. Allow me to do some advertisement. I think this is a really informative, really interesting, data-driven research presented by Dr. Clarke. Now we have more questions coming out, particularly his concern about the security of Taiwan as a result of uh, different candidates coming out from the election. I think either Trump or Biden wins election, and there will be some repercussions, particularly in the Taiwan case, and because China could have different reactions. No matter what reactions, Taiwan will be at the forefront of it. Now, this is why we uh, put this series on U.S. election, because U.S. American elections are very important to Taiwan society too. I believe there are a lot of Taiwan uh, uh, citizens, and they are very concerned who will come out November 3rd to be the new president. And this is why we have a U.S. election series. So next week, the same time, Professor Christopher Aiken will pay attention to a question that Dr. Clarke just mentioned, how these surveys are representative, uh, or are we in the era of uh, unrepresentative polls or unrepresented surveys? How do we embrace these polls and these evaluate or predict what will happen? So do we just count on the survey, count on the polls? There will be some really interesting topic. I believe that all of you would like to join me to come to Dr. Aiken's talk. All right. So let me do some advertisement. Allow me to do that, and this will be another talk we have. So this will be Professor Christopher Aiken. And do you see my screen share now? And let me see this. Okay. So studying elections in an era of unrepresentative surveys by Christopher Aiken of Princeton University. Please next week at the same time, 9 o'clock, 9 a.m. Taiwan time, 8 p.m. Dallas time or Central time in U.S. Please register and join us next week. And anyways, and this is only advertisement. If you have more questions, please go ahead and raise these questions. And but in the meantime, you can visit our website to register and plan to attend for this upcoming seminar.
Yeah, this is a great seminar, Carl, and I strongly encourage people to participate. And also, I'm grateful for having the opportunity. It's been great. But I'd also say Chris Aiken is outstanding, and so if people, he's always a very, very insightful person, a great scholar. So I strongly recommend his colloquium.
Oh, great. So actually, like Dr. Clarke, Professor Aiken is also very familiar with the Taiwan politics and elections. And both of these scholars will I think Dr. Clarke gave his insight already. I think Chris will also do similar. And if you'd like to hear what these American scholars and would predict for the Taiwan future, of course, paying attention to the U.S. election, I think please come next week. All right.
Yep.
Dr. Pan.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again to Dr. Clarke. Thank you for this wonderful presentation, and it's really insightful, and we got a lot of insight from your presentation. And thank you again for your time and your effort joining the DSC. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you very much, Carl. Thank you very much, audience, as well. And
all right. Yeah.
I'm very pleased to have the opportunity. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. And we will please visit our website. We will have more upcoming seminars to be posted, or give us feedbacks, or even if you want to like us in Twitter or Facebook, and you can do that. And please give us some feedback and support this series, this colloquium. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye,
right.
everyone.
Yeah.
Bye. Bye.
Okay.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye-bye, Dr. Clarke. All right, and do you have some concluding remarks, Dr. Pan?
Well, next time or next week, I'm expecting, looking forward to Dr. Aiken's presentation. So for all the
Yeah.
audience, please come back. And
Yes.
if there's any questions following this presentation, you can just go on the website and
Yes.
leave any message. And Dr. Ho or myself, we will just quickly respond to your questions. Thank you
Yeah.
all.
And the PowerPoint or any materials will be uploaded to our GitHub. Please check out the website. There's a GitHub link to that. Yeah. All right.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.